Yeah, data transformation is a key capability of any mature integration platform. So then Toomey is going to present a variety of options for data mapping in Microsoft Azure, including cloud-hosted BizTalk maps, liquid templates, and more. And he will also reveal an excellent tool for documenting this transformation. Over to Dan.
Okay. Well, thanks, Lex, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. This is actually my 6th year in a row speaking at this, but it's my 10th year in a row attending. And I think we can all agree this is by far the best integration conference of the year. So I'm very, very privileged to be here and be invited to speak. So thank you very much to Kavai for doing that. And while we're on the subject of gratitude, whoops, it would help if I turn this on. There we go. Oh. Okay. That should, it unplugged a little bit. What happened? Here we go. I shout out my employer, Deloitte, because they've been very supportive of all my MVP activities. They give me time off to do these things. And in this case, they also paid my airfare, which from Australia was pretty significant. So thanks very much to Deloitte. I also want to call out the Microsoft product team, so Divya, Praveen, and Shivam, all who kind of and also troubleshoot things. So that was very grateful to them. And lastly, I want to thank my editor, Joanne Een, who helped make these slides presentable to you today. So thanks for that. So standing up here in front of a bunch of integration professionals and enthusiasts, I'm sure I don't need to tell you how critical transformation capability is in any integration platform. The solutions and the applications that we integrate rarely speak the same language. But I think it's worth noting that aside from the most obvious things that transformation do, where you're changing the data structure of a message, field names, and maybe resolving cross-reference identifiers or translating reference data, is that transformation itself also is responsible for implementing some of the most important integration patterns that we all know and love from reading HOPE, for example. So, example, content enrichment, content filtering, aggregation, splitting, all of that stuff is enabled through the process of transformation. So if you're going to build an integration platform in the cloud, you want to be confident that that cloud is going to be able to handle those very critical capabilities. Now, this is where it's great to actually be at a live conference because I can actually have some audience involvement here. And I'm going to do that in the way of a quiz here. So what you see is the 6 main services that make up Azure Integration Services. And my question is to you, how many of these services do you think directly enable transformation? And to be clear, when I say transformation, I mean actually transforming the payload, right, of a message, the message body. I'll give you a hint. It's more than one. So for a show of hands, how many think it's 2 or more? OK. So based on what I said, everybody should have their hand up, right? Because I already said it's more than one. All right. So hands up again. How many think it's 3 or more? OK. 4 or more? 5? And lastly, 6. OK. At least one. OK. So it's a little bit of a trick question because you probably think that because he's making such a drama of this, it must be all 6, right? Well, here's my answer. It's actually, I count 4 of them. And the reason why I exclude Event Grid and Service Bus is because by the nature of those services, they should not be changing the message. The message itself is immutable in those services. But everything else actually can be used quite effectively. And the rest of my talk is really going to be discussing 6 different scenarios for a transformation across those 4 capabilities in Azure. Now, there's probably more scenarios as well, but this is what I can afford to cover in this one session. So the first one is BizTalk Maps. So I'm sure this question has been asked multiple times, but I couldn't see from my position over in that room. How many people here are using BizTalk Server? Either, IaaS or a lot, right? Okay. How many of you are thinking about either doing or thinking about or wishing that you could migrate BizTalk Server to the cloud? Yeah, quite a few. So this will be very relevant to you. There's a lot of diverse opinions about the BizTalk mapper. Some developers love it, some developers hate it. But whatever your opinion about what it is, you have to admit that it is a pretty darn intuitive way to represent transformations in your message. I mean, you have your source schema on the left, you got your target schema on the right, you draw your lines across. It's very, very clear. And for those who may be not as familiar with BizTalk, those little colorful squares in the middle of that map are called functoids. No, that's not something you need to go to your chemist or pharmacist to get treatment for. Those things are actually provide extra functionality. They do things like string manipulation, date manipulation. They can do calculations, all those little extra features that you need that simply drawing a straight line across doesn't achieve in a map. So what happens is you have Visual Studio. This is enabled through the developer SDK. You create these beautiful looking maps, and then when you compile the solution, it actually spits out XSLT, which of course is the industry standard for doing XML transformations. And one of the nice things about the maps is that it's a little bit self-documenting. I mean, you can show that map to a business or a systems analyst, and they understand what it is you're doing. Until, of course, your map looks like that. That's not really so helpful. But in any case, if you're thinking about migrating to Azure, okay, so this is now a quiz from Stephen's presentation that you just had this morning. What is the easiest artifact from your BizTalk solution to migrate to Azure? Anybody want to tell me? Sorry? Schemas. Absolutely, schemas, perfect. You don't change them. The schema is the schema. It's the same whether it's on cloud or on-prem. The second most easiest thing, in most cases, is probably your maps. And the reason is because you can host your BizTalk maps in Azure using Logic Apps. Now, to be clear, in Visual Studio, when you develop a map, it creates a BTM file, a .btm. That's not what you actually migrate. You need to actually produce the XSLT that map compiles into. So just to review the steps for that, in Visual Studio, you'd right-click your map file, and you select Validate Map. And what that does is it runs the compiler and makes sure that it can actually properly produce XSLT from your map. When you've done that, the output actually gives you a link to that XSL file, and then you can open it and save it. And in this case, you're going to be using that to migrate to Azure. Now, the next step depends on whether or not you're using consumption Logic Apps or standard Logic Apps. If you're using consumption, then you need to have an integration account to host your maps and your schemas. So both of those would be uploaded to your integration account. And then you need to go into the Logic app that you're going to host that map in and make sure you associate the integration account with it. That's a very simple setting to do in workflow settings. I will demonstrate it for you shortly. If you're using standard Logic Apps, then it's a simpler story because there is no integration account. Instead, the schemas and maps get loaded into the standard Logic app itself. Now, on the surface, that appears like that's a really big win for standard Logic Apps, right? You don't have to use an integration account for this, which means you can save quite a bit of money doing that. There is a caveat, though. Those functoids that you might have in your map are implemented, or most of them are implemented using C# script. What the integration account provides you is a runtime for that C# to go. Unfortunately, the standard Logic app doesn't provide that for you, which means that pretty much all of your functoids are not going to work out of the box. Now, there is workarounds for it, but it just means you're going to have to make some modifications. Consumption, though, almost all the functoids would run. The exceptions for that are any functoids that call external assemblies. Again, it's not impossible. You're just going to have to do some modifications. And I think Stephen mentioned that this morning, that there's a few changes. Sometimes they're very minor to get that to work. So probably just worth reviewing the integration account, what it's going to cost you. That is in US dollars. Most of the time, if you're just doing schemas and maps, a basic account will suit just fine. The standard is really more if you're doing EDI and you have all those agreements and stuff and certificates that go along with that. There is a free integration account, but it has no SLA and it's not meant to be used in production. It will allow you to host a few maps, but only one of those is allowed in any Azure subscription. Okay, so let's talk about a demo. So the demo example I'm going to use is this map, which is pretty simple. We're converting a purchase order into an invoice. It exhibits some of the typical characteristics that you have to deal with in transformation. For example, content filtering. We're not mapping the things we don't need in our target message. There's a bit of data structure changes. We're changing what's attributes into elements and changing the names. We're doing a string concatenation, 2 fields that are coming down into one. A bit of date manipulation where we set the current date for the invoice date and then add 14 days to that for the payment due date. And we're also calculating the total price by, for each order item, multiplying the quantity by the price and then doing a cumulative sum of all of that. And the example that we're going to use here is this one. This is an example purchase order. So I've got a bunch of integration artifacts that I want migrated to Azure, and I'm going to call on my good friend Wagner to go and do that migration for me. So he, of course, generates an invoice for me to pay for that. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the XSLT from my BizTalk map that I've extracted. And a couple of things I want to call out. At the very top of that file, you're going to see these user C# namespace and calls to functions. That's the implementation of the functoids. Because at the bottom of the map, you have all the C# script that enables that. And that covers even the most simple things that you're doing. For example, just getting the current date, or even concatenating 2 strings. All that's implemented in C# script, which is what causes a headache in standard Logic Apps. Okay, so once we have this XSLT file, we need to upload that to our integration account. So I've already done that here, but just to show you how easy it is to do that, in your integration account on your maps, you click Add. You point to the file that you want to upload. So we'll choose, video is running a little bit slow this time. Okay, so we'll choose our version 1. That'll set the name, but very important that you set the map type. For BizTalk maps, it's always XSLT, but it does handle later versions of XSL as well, but it has to match the actual file that you're uploading. So we're not going to save that because it's already there. But there's where you, if you want to, you can have a look at the files. You can't edit them, but you can at least view the contents of it. So now we need to go to our Logic app, and we need to associate this integration account with that Logic app. And you do that through your workflow settings, and there's a drop-down there for integration account. Now, if your integration account doesn't appear in the drop-down list, it probably is because it's either not in the same region or in the same subscription as your Logic app. Those are the requirements for that. Okay, now we go into the designer itself, and here you see it's very simple. It takes an HTTP request. I'm using a transform XML shape. Give it the body of the message, and then drop down here will list all of the XSLT maps that I have uploaded in my associated integration account. And that's all ready to go, so we'll now go and call it. So here in Postman, I've got my invoice. It's the same invoice instance that I showed you in the PowerPoint. And we're going to go, hopefully that's readable. Okay. We'll go click send, and hopefully we're going to get back, sorry, it was a purchase order, but hopefully we're going to get back an invoice. Now let's see if all those functoids worked. First thing is the payment due date. It looks like it is correctly calculated 14 days from the invoice date, which is great. The string concatenation was the next one, I think. Yep, and that has worked. Let's put my first and last name there. And let's see if it could calculate the total price properly. All right, so we've got $13.60. Well, if we look through each item, you got 1 for 1,000, 2 for 30, and 3 for 100, and that adds up to $13.60. So we've just proven that I've taken my BizTalk map with no modifications and the functoids in there, successfully uploaded that to Azure and run it successfully in the Logic app, and everything worked fine. Sunny days scenario. probably isn't always like that, but at least it is in this example. So it proves that works. So some considerations when you're using this approach. Obviously, we're working in XML land, right? Because that's all that BizTalk Maps can deal with. It's a great scenario for when you're migrating your BizTalk Maps, or even if you just really hate writing XSLT. You know, I have to give you a secret. You don't actually have to install BizTalk in order to use the mapper. If you have an MSDN license and you have Visual Studio 2019, I think, or later, you can download the image for developer image for BizTalk, and all you need to install are the developer tools on your local machine. You don't have to even, you don't have to run BizTalk because you're just using it to generate maps. Something to be aware of, though, is that the mapper, and it's actually not really so much a mapper constraint as it is a .NET Framework constraint, it can only produce version 1.0 of XSLT. So there's a lot of extra enhancements that come with the later versions of XSLT that you don't get with this. And as I mentioned, not all of the functoids are going to be supported out of the box, or at least not without some manipulation. And at the end of this slide is a list of references, and the very first article that I put in there is a long, it's actually a two-part TechNet series that goes through all the scenarios of issues that you can encounter with migrating BizTalk maps and solutions for them. So it's an excellent article resource for you. Okay, and further references, obviously a great opportunity to plug Sandro's book. Even if you're not using BizTalk to generate your XSLT, the book has some really excellent tips in there about handling XML transformations. And some poor soul spent way too many hours of his life writing a Pluralsight course on how to use all of the functoids. And so if you're ever lying awake at night thinking, how do I use a cross-reference identifier functoid? Or how the heck do I get my table extractor functoid to work? Then this is the course for you. And then you probably should get a life. Okay, so method number 2 is now we're just uploading XSLT. And you're probably sitting there thinking, wait a minute, didn't we just cover that right now? And the answer is yes, we did. The only difference here is it doesn't necessarily come from a BizTalk map. Why am I mentioning that? Because now you're free to also use later versions of XSLT. And in many cases, if your functoids are giving you issues in your migration, you can replace those functoids with key capabilities that are in the later versions of XSLT. For example, that's actually what I'm going to demo right now, is I'm going to show you how I took this same XSLT and replaced everything that was being done with functoids with just XSLT 2.0 or 3.0 functions. So, first thing that I want you to notice in this modified XSLT file is the version number. I've changed it to version 3.0 to show that this is the template version I'm calling on. You'll also notice that there are no longer these references to use a C# namespace with the function calls because they're gone. And just waiting for the video to catch up. This was here in the old version. You don't see that anymore in the new one. Instead, what you do see is some calls to some standard XSLT functions. For example, getting the current date and calculating 14 days later using the daytime duration. These are built into XSLT 2.0, I think, introduced those ones. Concatenating two strings, very simple to do. And even calculating the total price, I only needed one line of XSLT to do that across. So now that I have this new XSLT template, of course, I needed to upload it to my integration account because I'm using a consumption app in this case. I want to draw your attention that the type I had to set to XSLT 3.0 to tell that this is the version of XSLT that I want you to use. You can look at the file just as you always did before. And now we're going to go back to our Logic app. And this is the same Logic app we just used, but we're going to make a small modification. We're going to go into the transform XML shape, and I'm now going to select my new map, which is based on version 3. Okay, and we'll go ahead and save that, and then we'll run this. It catches up. Okay, so this is our Postman instance again. You can still see the response in there that I got from the last time I ran this. If we run it again, hopefully we get the same output or very similar looking output. And we do. So now let's check and see if all that functionality is still working. The payment due date still shows 14 days later than the invoice date, which is great. The concatenation works, and the total price is still $13.60. So everything worked fine in this case. So I've proven that I can remove all the functoids, replace it with XSLT functions, upload that, and still run it. So again, we're still working in XML land. We still have the capability of migrating existing resources, but XSLT 2 and 3.0 gives you more features which can help you eliminate some of the problem functoids. One of the key drivers for doing this would be so that you could actually use Logic Apps Standard, which doesn't support functoids. Unfortunately, at the moment, Logic Apps Standard doesn't support XSLT 2.0 or 3.0, but it's on the roadmap, and in fact, right now is in private preview. So that QR code on that slide will take you to a GitHub page where the product team has listed their roadmap for all of the Logic Apps Standard connectors, and you'll see that it appears on there. So it's coming. Okay, so the first two solutions have been talking about use XML. But we know that all the cool kids use JSON these days. So obviously the BizTalk mapper isn't gonna help too much with that. The answer for that is Liquid. And if you're wondering what Liquid is, it's a templating language. Think about Microsoft Word documents with mail merge in it, right? You've got placeholders for being able to insert data, dynamic data. They're called tags in Liquid templates. And the templates support sort of processing functionality like iteration, conditional logic, variables, and a bunch of built-in functions. Not as many as XSLT, but there's a few in there. And you call those by using filters, which are the pipes, right, the vertical pipes. The cool thing about Liquid is that it works with any text-based file. So it not only works with JSON, but it works with XML or flat files as well. So you can use Liquid almost anywhere. Logic Apps gives you the ability to host Liquid and to do at least 4 operations on there. You can go transform from JSON to JSON, JSON to text, XML to JSON, or XML to text. Now, what's important to understand is that there's different flavors of Liquid out there. I think the original one was Shopify, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, okay. And then there's also Jekyll, and there's also .liquid. So Logic Apps, sorry?
Ruby.
Sorry?
Ruby.
Ruby, oh, Ruby, okay. So .liquid is what's used by Logic Apps. And of course, not only are there different flavors, but there are different versions of those, and it's not consistent, the behavior across. So Logic Apps is using .liquid version 2. I think the current version is version 2.2. I'm told that it's on the roadmap to get that upgraded soon. So just be aware that if you're testing your Liquid templates, which you should independently, they may not run the same in Logic Apps if you're not running the same version. Okay, so a demo of this. We're going to use the same scenario with the purchase order and invoice, only now my purchase order is in JSON format. And I'm going to use this Liquid template to transform it into an invoice. So let's just look at this very carefully. One of the things I wanted to point out is it's a lot more intuitive than XSLT, isn't it? It's easier to look at. One key thing to point out is that because JSON doesn't usually have a named root node like XML does, when you're executing a compiler to use Liquid template, you generally tell it what you're going to refer to your root node as, right? In Logic Apps, you don't get that opportunity. So in Logic Apps, it is content, the word content with small c. So just keep that in mind, that's how you would reference. So looking at this, this is the Liquid template that I'm going to use in my demo. You'll see the first thing that I'm doing in here when the video catches up is I'm setting a variable called total price, and I'm initializing that to 0. I'm then going through my message and assigning all the fields. I'm using the built-in date functions to set the current date, and also add 14 days. So that big integer there, that number is the number of seconds in 2 weeks' time. That's how you calculate that. I'm using the append function to do the concatenation, and I'm also going to then, sorry, the video is running a little bit slow for some reason. I'm going to iterate through all of my order items to fill those out. So a for loop is supported And I'm also going to, on the way, keep using that variable to track the cumulative amount as we go along. So this is all a valid liquid template, which works when I test it offline. So now I'm using a Logic Apps standard, which means I don't have an integration account. What I have is my artifacts there, where I would upload my schemas and my maps. So my map is already there. You can see the liquid map is already present. And then we'll look at the workflow itself. And you'll see that, yes, I get in. Okay, we're using a transform JSON to JSON shape, which is very simple. It looks just like the XML transform, which is that we give it the content that's going in, which is the body and a message, and we're executing my liquid template. Now, it will only show the liquid templates in that dropdown for this shape. Okay, with all that, I can run this demo now. So there's my purchase order in JSON format, already pointing at my Logic app. We're going to now execute that, and hopefully we should get a JSON invoice coming from that. And we do. And we just have a quick look at the structure of that, and it seems like it's all worked out pretty well. Here we go. So this is how we do JSON transformations in Azure. So obviously, this is a good use case for working with JSON, but as I mentioned, it can work with any text file. So if you prefer to use Liquid over XSLT and your templates are simple enough to support it, no reason you can't do the same with that. Just remember that there are different versions of .liquid out there, and some things may not work the way you're expecting if you're tested with a different version. Okay, so far, all three methods that I've mentioned before have certain issues or caveats with them. So this one, I can promise you, will be able to handle just about anything that you want to do. But to do that, you got to get down and dirty into the code. Now, a lot of developers just go to this anyway because they just like working with code. I know a lot of my colleagues at Deloitte do the same. They'll just go straight to Azure Functions because you have complete control. Right? You can code in the language you want. You can control your parameters. To some extent, you're in control of the runtime environment, all of that. So you can still use Liquid and XSLT if you want to, and whatever version or flavor that you like. Or you can also just use straight code. And if you're going to do that in C#, then I would recommend this library called AutoMapper. It's really a very helpful library for being able to map from one message to another. It's intuitive and it eliminates some of the pain points in all of that. That's the demo I'll show you now. And this one I'm actually going to do a live demo because I'm running it on my local machine, so I know it'll be fast enough. Okay, so what you see here is my Azure function. You'll see that I've imported AutoMapper here, the library for that. And the first thing I'll show you is that I've had to declare the classes to describe my message coming in, because we're going to deserialize that JSON into .NET objects, right? So I've got my class for purchase order and invoice, and then all of the little sub kind of objects that make that up. And now in my main function, you'll see how AutoMapper works. It's very simple. You define a mapper configuration. We're transforming a purchase order to an invoice. And for each line where it isn't completely obvious what the transformation is, I can explicitly identify it using this kind of syntax. So what AutoMapper does is if the source and target name and data type is the same, you don't even have to tell it what to do. It will figure that out and do it automatically. But where you do have to have a difference of change, you have to explicitly tell it. And in this case, for different names, also when I'm calling functions or datetime things, here I'm actually calling a function to calculate the total price. I do explicitly declare that. But it's not really very painful, as you can tell. All right, so let's run this. Okay, all I have to do is func start, and this shouldn't take very long. In a few seconds, it's going to give me a URL, which will be on localhost, because I'm running it locally, and I'll be able to test that this function is working. And it is the same scenario. It's the same purchase order to invoice. So there's my URL. If I go into my Postman I've already got it loaded to my local host. I just have to now submit this, and I should get a response back very quickly. So let's see if that all worked. There's my payment due date, which again is 14 days after the invoice date. I've got my full structure. I've got the string concatenation. I've got my order items, and I've got a total price calculated at $13.60. So everything's working. All right. So Azure Functions should be able to solve any of those problems that you might have had in other methods. And after all, some people just like working in code. One of the benefits of it is that it's so easy to unit test it and everything when you're working with code. So it does have some advantages. The only disadvantage, I guess, is that you don't get that nice little graphical image, to show you how your mapping works. But I have something later to show you about that. Okay, method number 5, API management. It shouldn't be any surprise to anyone that API management can do things like convert XML to JSON and vice versa, because we know that one of the use cases for API management, is that it can take SOAP services and then make them turn into REST services, right? But I wonder if you knew that it actually, through policy, you can execute XSLT in API management. You can also have ability to find and replace strings. And how many people have ever had to write BizTalk maps just to basically change a namespace, where you have a message that looks almost identical, but just a namespace? So conceivably, I think you could do that through a policy in APIM. You can also replace the entire message body. And if you're doing that, you can use liquid templates too to help with that. So it's quite versatile. You can use these policies everywhere in all the different policy sections and all the different scopes. I'm not going to do a demo of this because I don't have time, but just be aware that that's a possibility. Sometimes it might be advantageous for you to actually execute your transformation right at the front door when you're coming in, especially if you have no other reason to have an integration component like a workflow or something. It's probably some limitations on what it can do, though, compared to others. And then I have to mention Azure Data Factory, right? Because as we know, Azure Data Factory is Azure's ETL flow for the cloud. And what does the T in ETL stand for?
Export, transform, load.
Yes, transform, exactly, right. So this is what it does, but it does it in those situations where it's not so much in an EAI or an ESB type situation, but when you're actually just moving data from one location to another. So it's really good for performing data migrations, for example. And there's a lot of stuff it can do. If you haven't worked with Data Factory before, that QR code will take you to a quick start tutorial and get you started. And that tutorial example is perfect to show you that what you build is a pipeline, and the pipeline has multiple steps, and each step can perform a transformation on its own. In this case, you start with a movies database, which is a huge, huge flat file. The first step filters out down to just a small year range and a genre of comedy. And then the third one, the aggregate, is basically rolls that up to give you an output of the number of comedies for each year. So, but even if you're just doing straight copy data from one place to another, if the target has different column names, you can achieve that as well through Data Factory. So again, I'm not going to show a demo of that, but you can follow that QR code to do the example. So this is obviously when you're using ELT or ETL. There's both acronyms are valid for performing data migrations. I can't really think of any caveats to that. If you're in that world, this is the tool to use. So, all right. So summing up. This table basically gives you sort of a single pane of view glass of what I've just discussed in all those scenarios. I won't talk through it in detail. And I will be sharing these slides somewhere, so you'll be free to reference this. What I also need to mention, of course, is what you heard the other day when Kent and Wagner were up here about the Universal Data Mapper. Microsoft recognizes that some of this is a little bit painful, so they're working on something to help make that easier. So we're looking great anticipation to see what they come up with. The mock-ups look certainly promising. Okay, how am I doing on time? Because what I'd like to do is just spend a couple of minutes and digress to something which is very, very related to transformations. This isn't about generating solutions, but it's more about documenting the specifications for it. So a colleague of mine has created this website called apimap.com. And what it is an online tool for being able to generate maps and transformation documentation in a visual format. So the really cool thing about it is that it works with both JSON and XML, and you can basically produce, BizTalk style diagrams like that. So you use it to define your transformation. It creates the diagram. You can export the diagram and the Excel file, and it also has one other nifty feature that I've seen before. So let me just demonstrate this. I'll go in here. So you create an account on here. So I'm signed into my account or my workspace, and you can basically upload your schemas. It'll take JSON or XSD. The schemas give you that nice hierarchical view that we're used to, for example, from working in BizTalk. So you can see that I've got my invoice schema in there. And then you can create your maps, and your map files will look like this diagram. So I won't go through the process of actually creating one for you because it'll take too long, but this is what they look like. When you click on any given element, it actually gives you all of the context specific to that element. So it isolates in a separate view for you. It shows whether it's a direct mapping or whether it's another kind of transformation, for example, a computation or setting a specific constant value. And what I really like about this is that, and I haven't seen this in any other tool, is that if I have another map that maps invoice to shipping notice, for example, I can add that to my diagram, and it will actually show you the end-to-end mapping across that. So think about how many times we have a canonical schema, right? And you can actually show the whole path going all the way through. And one other nifty thing it does too is you can add UI annotations. So let's say that this corresponds to a form, right? You can have a screenshot or a mock-up of that form and actually add it as an annotation to when you're describing these schemas to make it absolutely clear. Yes, I mean this field on this form. And it gives you the ability to highlight that field. So I think it's a pretty nifty product and helpful. It doesn't yet generate code, but if you are interested in this, what I would do is maybe tweet Joseph and tell him, hey, this is a really, really nifty tool. And if he gets enough interest in it, he might pick it up again and start working on it and doing those future enhancements that he's been thinking about. Or maybe he might even be willing to open source it, I don't know, and have people help with building the project. Okay. So here's that, just the key takeaways from this. So we know that data transformation is a critical part of any integration platform, and we now see that Azure provides multiple ways to address that, so you can be confident by moving to the cloud with Microsoft that you'll be able to handle that in one way or another. And API Map, as I've introduced, is a helpful tool for being able to define documentation and requirements to give to developers. This is that list of references, and that first article that I mentioned is an excellent two-part series that goes through all the different ways that you can troubleshoot some migration of BizTalk maps to the cloud. And with that, that's me. I'm done. So. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Yeah. When it comes to XSLT in Logic App standard. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, when it comes to XSLT in Logic App standard, so taking out C# code can be quite vital for many of the developers, because there are some functions that XSLT will not be able to provide us. For instance, when it comes to changing the date based on the culture info. So C# works just fine with XSLT1 and other kind of transformation language. But in XSLT3, I don't believe that, or at least I'm pretty sure, almost sure, that there is no support for such thing. And in many scenarios, we need to have some sort of some flexibility. So C# did a great job with XSLT1 with BizTalk, or even with Azure Logic Apps as well when we do that. This is the first thing about XSLT. The second one, for Liquid in standard for all Logic Apps actually, it's really convenient to have the version, or to have a written info about the Liquid transformation version that you are using in your Logic app. Yeah, because this is very important. For instance, today you named that we are using Liquid .NET 2.0.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure about that, because there are some functions we couldn't get in Logic App. For instance, you cannot get the gToken name, for instance, in any way in Logic App today. But if you are using it with C# and Liquid.NET, so you can get that. Handling arrays in in Liquid today is kind of
absolutely
tough. So I believe, those two things: support C# in XSLT, and naming the version that we are using in the Logic Apps.
Great. Okay, so in response to that, first in regards to the C# stuff that you can't do in XSLT, that might be a situation where you have to resort to using Azure Functions. But if you look on that roadmap page that I had, it looks like, it suggests to me that they're considering bringing integration account functionality into Logic App Standard. And if that happens, maybe that includes the ability to run. I don't know. I'm guessing, okay? So don't take that as anything. But that's one possibility. And the other comment you made about Liquid, yes, it's annoying because of the inconsistency. And if you looked really, really carefully on that screen, I kind of glossed past it. It didn't actually do all the calculations correctly, because yes, the functions are not working consistently.
Besides, for instance, one of the filters I struggled with is where in Liquid. It didn't work for me.
Yes.
Version of .NET Liquid.
It's not working in the current version either?
Which is supported by Logic Apps standard.
Yes, right. Yeah, well, so Logic Apps is
the newer version of .NET Liquid, it's supporting,
Yes.
But the problem that it's not there in the Logic Apps.
Oh, okay. That's exactly right. So Logic Apps hasn't caught up yet with the latest version. So.
Yeah. But just going back to the point that you were talking about, that in that term we need to use Azure Function to implement C# code. And when you do that in a map, I mean, you are just mapping the information from the source to the destination. And using an Azure function just to do this transformation or data format, I don't think it's convenient. I mean, I will not create an Azure function just to do the daytime conversion from one culture to another.
Well, yeah, it's unfortunate. It's a shame if there's only one little thing like that that's stopping you from using, and then you have to go resort to. Yes, unfortunately, that's a drawback of XSLT, though, isn't it?
Maybe one more question.
Any other questions?
Anybody?
Oh, we do have one.
When I tried Liquid templates about 2 years ago, it did not handle comma characters in the input correctly. It produced broken JSON.
Okay.
Have you run into that, or do you know if it's?
I honestly haven't used Liquid enough to come across that particular issue. I know I had a few headaches getting this to work.
Yeah.
But not that particular issue with commas. But yeah, I've seen there's lots and lots of posts out there about people troubleshooting issues and suggestions. Actually, I do remember seeing one post about a comma, something saying they had to remove.
Because XSLT is agnostic with the input, but
yes,
Liquid is not.
No, it's not as forgiving, is it?
Yeah.
So it's very good. It's easy. It's good for very simple kind of template transformations. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
Thank you
Thanks for your
very
session.
much.
Cove.co